You don't resent somebody sort of jabbing you in the ribs because you're snoring or whatever. And you can have nice little rituals of getting together in the morning to have a cup of tea or whatever. So I don't see the problem at all. But there is that psychology that, it's you've got to sleep together. Don't agree with it. Mm-hmm.
If I think about the UK or the US, I would imagine that in these countries and cultures, there may be a bit of pushback.
Oh yes.
And go, no, if you're in a couple, you sleep in the same bed.
Yeah.
But I imagine there's many cultures around the world where this is not the case.
That's true, and there's a whole spectrum. So I remember when I first went to Germany with my wife, and we were given this fantastic room, huge bed, but separate duvets, which is a really smart thing because often the temperature ranges for couples will change. So separate duvets is a really easy solution to that. Snoring is, of course, a lot more problematic, but also in cultures like Japan, it's very frequent that the children sleep with the mother and the father sleeps separately. So there's every sort of relationship, and of course, the aristocrats, it was always, they always had separate bedrooms.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was chatting to one of my best mates about this recently, and he's a spinal surgeon on the south coast of England, and he said to me, mate, no way, that's the start of the end.
Yeah.
If you don't sleep in the same bed as your partner. That's how ingrained it is.
Yes.
But I guess let's look at the flip side. In our first conversation, we discussed together how poor sleep has so many impacts on our short-term and long-term health. And if we just think about the short-term, poor sleep leads to less compassion, less empathy,
reduced sense of humour.
Humour.
You need humour in a relationship.
Yeah, so by that logic, of course, if sleeping in the same bed is resulting in one or both parties not getting enough sleep, which means you have less empathy, less sense of humour, less tolerance to a whole host of different things, it kind of stands to reason if you have the space, and of course not everyone does.
That's the issue.
Yeah. Right? If you have the space and the capability, it might actually improve your relationship.
That's how I would argue it, absolutely, yes. Now you have to be slightly careful because what you want to make sure that your partner doesn't have obstructive sleep apnea. So this is where the musculature of the neck will collapse and block the airway. And so they'll be sort of snoring away and then they'll just stop. And then they'll wake themselves up, the brain realises it's been deprived of oxygen, and so the individual wakes up and splutters and snores and all the rest of it. And now that's serious, and that needs to be looked at by a GP. And there are easy ways to fix it. So, just make sure that your partner doesn't have obstructive sleep apnea.
So when you're giving us that warning, are you essentially saying, let's look after our partner? If you think there's an issue before you move into the spare room, just have a look and at least ask the question, could this be sleep apnea? Is that what you're getting at?
Exactly, yes. And of course you can get apps which you can download and actually listen to your snoring pattern. And people have done that. And they're pretty accurate too. So yes, just be careful that it's not obstructive sleep apnea. Snoring is one issue. And of course snoring can be enhanced by increased weight gain. Rather sadly, as we get older, we deposit more fat in the tongue, and so that can also restrict the airway. Alcohol, of course, will relax the musculature, and you're much more prone to snore if you've had too much alcohol.
Yeah, it's interesting. I spoke to the US physician, Dr. William Lee, last year on this podcast, and he's done a lot of research into food, but also visceral fats.
Mm-hmm.
And he said one of the first places we store visceral fat in the body is in the tongue.
I know, isn't it extraordinary? Who would have thought it? Yeah.
So,
it's bad enough getting old without having a fat tongue.
You mentioned snoring and you mentioned obstructive sleep apnea.
Yep.
Just so we're bringing everyone along and no one's getting confused, they're different things, aren't they?
Yeah, they
can be overlap.
Yeah, exactly, yes. So snoring will be just the vibration of the tissues in the back of the throat.
Anything to be worried about snoring?
I don't know. I mean, if it's very loud, I'd sort of think about some corrective measures, such as making sure that you're not drinking too much, that you may want to sort of prop yourself up a bit. But broadly speaking, straight snoring is nothing to be particularly worried about. But obstructive sleep apnea is, because what you're doing is you're having periods of oxygen deprivation to the brain. And then when the brain wakes itself up, you're getting surges in blood pressure, and that can be very bad for the small vasculature in the eye, for example, and of course in the brain. So that really does need to be looked at. And so there's a correlation between our higher rates of obstructive sleep apnea and dementia, for example.
If someone is listening to this and they do snore, or their partner snores, and they're not sure, is this just a bit of mild snoring, or is this something more serious? What would you advise them to do?
Well, ideally, you go to your GP and they'll recommend you go to a clinic, and you'll spend a night, and then they'll look at you in some detail, and they'll monitor the breathing and the snoring and potentially the obstructive sleep apnea. But there are so few sleep clinics like that, it's tricky. And I mentioned that there are apps you can download, and so what I would recommend is talking to the GP, seeing what the options are, and if there's a waiting list of 2 years or whatever it is to get to the sleep clinic, ask specifically about what NHS recommends in terms of downloadable apps to monitor your snoring and potential sleep apnea.
Now, in our first conversation, Russell, I asked you what your views on sleep trackers were, and you were quite clear that there's very few uses you thought they were good for. You were sort of saying that, sure, for some people they might be okay, but you were saying that no sleep federation actually endorses the use of them.
Yeah, that's still the case.
So that's still the case.
Still the case, yeah. And so none, and also none are FDA approved at the moment.
Which means what? For an individual who's thinking, you know what, I see all these adverts for sleep trackers, maybe a ring or maybe a bracelet that I wear 24/7. Why should they be concerned, or why should they proceed with caution over the fact that you just said they're not approved by the sleep federations?
Yeah, well, so for example, you'll often read medically validated, and that can mean just about anything. And so, for example, what it often means, and excuse me for being cynical, is that it's been tested on 8 Californian undergraduates for a couple of nights in the sleep lab. If you're lucky, sometimes it's only 1 night in the sleep lab, and that's just not good enough. And also, because sleep is so dynamic, as we discussed last time, a single algorithm is simply not going to work across the variety of sleep patterns that we see, and as sleep changes as we age. Now, I'm down on them now, and as I said before, they can be useful in terms of telling you roughly what time you went to sleep and what time you woke up, and that can be then if you woke up in the middle of the night. But anything more sophisticated than that, I would be very uneasy about. And indeed, there are now instances of people using these devices and getting sleep anxiety. It's now a recognized condition.
Yeah.
People get so worried about the sleep information they're getting from these apps, and they're in large measure inaccurate. So don't take them too seriously. However, what I think is on the horizon with AI is a much more interactive device, which means that it can pick up biometric signals, accurate biometric signals.
And what does that mean?
Well, it can tell roughly what your breathing rate is, your pulse rate, and your activity, and integrate that into the algorithm. Say, tweak the algorithm, fix. As time goes on, I would imagine in 10 years' time, they will be more useful, and they probably give a much greater accuracy for the sleep that we actually experience.
Yeah, I guess so. Like many things, it's early technology.
Yeah.
It's rapidly evolving.
Yeah.
And maybe in the future they'll be a lot more accurate. It was really interesting. I don't think I shared this with you last time we spoke. In fact, I don't think I'd had the conversation at that point. Just over a year ago, I spoke to the Kenyan elite marathon runner, Eli Kipchoge. He's the only marathon runner to have run under 2 hours, a marathon under 2 hours, which is just staggering, basically.
That's extraordinary.
And he does wear an Oura ring to track his sleep. And I asked him, on the morning of a big race, what happens? Do you look at it? What if you're running the scores out? He goes, I never look at it on the morning of a race. Because he knows that he doesn't sleep well, like all of us, the night before something big, or like many of us, I should say. And he knows for his optimal performance, in order to be confident, go into that race, perform at his best, he doesn't need to see a poor sleep score or a poor readiness score.
Absolutely. And I think that...
Which is quite telling.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. And of course, it's very interesting that we feel as though we need to be told by some inaccurate device how we feel. And we're in the best position to determine how we're feeling, whether we're firing all cylinders, where we're feeling, able to perform.
So what are the best questions that one can ask themselves to determine if their sleep is adequate or they're sleeping enough?
Oh, and that's straightforward. I suppose the first would be: do you feel you can function optimally during the day? Are you firing all your cylinders? Do you rely on an alarm clock to wake you up in the morning? Or a partner to wake you up in the morning if you're staying in the same bed? Do you feel tired and sleepy during the day? Critically, do you oversleep on free days at the weekend, for example?
And what does that mean?
Well, basically, normally, you've got to get up at a particular time during the week, and then you're sleeping in for 2 or 3 hours at the weekend, and that's telling you you're not getting enough sleep during the week, and so you need to go to bed earlier and get the sleep that you need. And it's worth bearing in mind that many people think, I can just completely catch up by oversleeping at the weekend. You can partially, but not fully. Some really interesting experiments have shown is you don't fully catch up after a weekend of oversleeping. You're still starting Monday with a sleep debt. So you've got to really get that stability. The other problem, of course, about oversleeping is that you're not getting the morning light, which is so important for setting the body clock and the sleep-wake cycle.
To make it really practical though, Russell, some people will say, I get what you're saying, but my life is tough in the week with my children, with my work demands. I just can't go to bed at a time that would be optimal, and I do need an alarm clock because my job is what feeds me and my family. In that situation, at the weekend, let's say on a conventional Monday to Friday job, is there a downside to sleeping in? And the second part to this question is, what about catch-up naps on a Saturday afternoon or a Sunday afternoon?
Yeah. Okay. So yes, it is difficult, but it's all about prioritizing. Because we can cut our sleep, we think that we can squeeze other sorts of activities into the time that we would normally sleep. So we've got to take our sleep seriously. And if we need 8 hours or 7 hours, we need to go to bed at a time that will deliver that duration of sleep that we need. So it is about prioritizing. Oversleeping, as we touched on, is you won't catch up fully, and you can delude yourself that you can, I can oversleep at the weekends, I'll be fine for Monday. The data suggests that is not the case. It can certainly reduce the sleep debt, but not fully. The other key thing, of course, is you're not getting that morning light. You're not getting that important time giver to set the clock and the sleep-wake cycle accordingly. So, all of the data that we've got suggests that it's regularity, which is the key thing that we have to achieve for our sleep-wake cycle.
You mentioned morning light. I know we covered it in our first conversation, but for anyone who's not heard that, perhaps give us an overview. What is morning light? Why is it so important, and how much do we need?
Yeah. So we have this internal clock, which is fine-tuning our biology to the very demands of the 24-hour day.
And what is it? You say internal clock. Many of us picture a clock on our desk, right? So when we say we have an internal clock, what does that look like?
Well, actually, there is a master.
We can see more of the...
And it's called the suprachiasmatic nuclei. So essentially you can think about where this is. As the optic nerves go into the brain and fuse, sitting above there is a small paired structure of about 50,000 cells. And each one of those cells is capable of generating an endogenous 24-hour rhythm. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And it's based upon a molecular feedback loop. So clock genes are turned on, they make their proteins. Those proteins then form a complex. They then go into the nucleus and turn turn off their own genes. The protein complex is then degraded, and then the whole thing can start again. And so it's a biological oscillation of about 24 hours, but it's not exactly 24 hours. And so it needs to be set to the real day. So the internal day needs to be aligned to the external day. And the most important thing for that, it's not the only thing, but the most important thing is light. Now, light does different things to the clock at different times. So morning light makes us get up early. It advances the clock. Evening light delays the clock, makes us get up later. Now, because most of us, 90% of us, have a body clock that is slightly longer than 24 hours, we, under constant conditions, would drift later and later and later. So what we need to be entrained to get that internal clock aligned to the external world is a daily nudge, an advance. That's why morning light is so important, because it gives us that advance, which is what we need on a daily basis. So interestingly, we did some studies on some students all over the world. And of course, students are notoriously late types. We found that the later the chronotype, and I know we touched on chronotypes last time, the more evening light they got, which would delay the clock at the expense of morning light. So they were sleeping through, not getting the advancing morning light, but they're out in the late afternoon, early evening, getting the dusk light, which is delaying the clock even further. So when we see light is so important.
So we want to get light exposure, ideally natural light outside, as close to our wake-up time as possible.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Now, a couple of things to elaborate on there. We're recording this conversation in January in the UK. So we're at the height of the British winter, which means it doesn't often, depends whether it's clouds in the sky or clear, but it can often be 8 a.m. until you're getting morning light.
Yeah, well, it is at the moment about 8 a.m. Yeah.
So many children, many adults are having to get up, let's say at 6:30 a.m. to get ready for their day's activities.
Yeah.
So they get up at 6:30, let's say with an alarm clock, which may not be ideal, but maybe in reality what's happening for a lot of people. Your advice is you need to get morning light as soon as possible.
Yep.
Now, morning light may not be available from the outside until 90 minutes after that.
Yes.
In the summer, again, easy. Everyone wants to go outside and get their feet on the grass if they have gone, whatever it is, right?
Yes.
On the wet, damp conditions at the moment, people don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So what's your advice with respect to that? And also, what does indoor lighting do and these kind of sad lamps, I guess? You know, what are they useful?
Well, they're certainly useful. And I think we could learn something from our Scandinavian cousins here. I'd say Tromsø, which I visited, it's the most extraordinary place.
Where's Tromsø?
Tromsø, northern Norway. And it's in the Arctic Circle. And of course, it's dark for 2 months of the year. And what the families do there is that they will have a light box, and it's set to produce more than 2,000 lux. And we can talk about lux levels in a moment. For 30 minutes, so 2,000 plus lux, perhaps as high as 10,000 lux in some cases. And they have their breakfast in a room where there's artificial light, and they use that to set the clock to the external world. Of course, there's not much of a light-dark cycle, but of course they're stabilizing it in a sense for social reasons.
And have they done that on the basis of scientific experiments, or has it been something that they figured out over time? We need to do this for our physical and mental well-being.
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, we've got good data showing that morning light is really important for stabilizing sleep-wake. And also, you mentioned seasonal affective disorder. The treatment, I mean, some data for SAD and light is really interesting. Many of us were very skeptical when this first emerged. You say, oh, well, you sit in front of a light box. What's the control? You sit in front of a light box and you don't turn the lights on. You can, you work out that it's not going to work. So is it just a placebo effect? And then a range of much more sophisticated experiments showed that it really was the light. And one fascinating study compared non-seasonal depression and light, and they compared placebo, Prozac, and 10,000 lux for 30 minutes in the morning, and light was more effective than placebo at 2 weeks, Prozac was only statistically significant at 8 weeks. And then light was more effective than Prozac. So light seems to be very powerful for both non-seasonal and seasonal depression.
This is a really interesting point, something I wanted to discuss with you today. This idea that light is medicine, this idea that light is a drug. But we, as a society, don't see light as a drug. We just think, well, we can expose ourselves to whatever light we want, whatever we want. Light is, separate to our lives. We get on with our lives, we do our work, we go on social media, we see our friends, we do whatever, but we don't give attention to light. But your trial that you just mentioned there, or certainly the trial you're citing, is really comparing light to a drug.
Yes,
Right?
absolutely. Yeah.
So in your view, should we consider light as powerful as drugs?
I think we absolutely can. And it would be naive not to think that, for the following reason. All life on Earth has evolved on a planet that rotates once every 24 hours. We're exposed to a light-dark cycle. The light-dark cycle has dominated our evolution and our biology. And because from the 1950s we could produce cheap, affordable, efficient light, we've invaded the night. And we've thrown away this incredible part of our biology as a result. And it's fascinating that the humans are wonderful. I mean, we're remarkably arrogant. We think we can do whatever we want, whatever time we choose. I mean, it's part of the success story. But actually, we do it at some considerable cost. And I think it's about tuning in to those incredibly powerful biological drivers, environmental drivers of our biology.
You say it's part of our success story. And again, this is something I've been reflecting on recently on long walks, Russell. This idea that we say that humans are really evolved and look at what we've achieved with our skyscrapers and our phones and our technology. But you could also make the case that we have epidemic rates of chronic disease. We have epidemic rates of mental health dysfunction. And so I guess sometimes we need to challenge the narrative that this is a success story. Do you know what I mean? I know that's slightly controversial, and I'm not pushing back at what you're saying. I just think as a general point, it's worth considering that there are some cultures and some parts in the world where, yes, let's say they've got other issues to contend with, but their chronic disease rates are much lower. They don't have mental health dysfunction. Like a lot of hunter-gatherer tribes, yes, they may have threats from predators, and we regard our lives as better, many of us, which speaks to this arrogance that I think many modern humans have. But I think we could also make a case to go, well, is it necessarily better?
So I'm certainly arguing for a bit more humility. It's all about its understanding. And of course, what we haven't had is out there the education that allows us to make sensible decisions about our lives. And that's the thing that's changing. And I think people are thinking, hang on, I do need to reconnect a bit. I do need to get that balance into balance. And so it's all about education for me, and it's trying to have the information to make the best decisions about our lives. And so that we can embrace the extraordinary successes of our species, but also not get kicked in the teeth by them.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's possible to have the best of, modern humanity if we just remember some of the kind of evolutionary principles, as it were. If we can remember those and apply them in the context of the modern world, we can possibly have our cake and eat it.
But I mean, we can't do everything that we want to do at any time of the day. There's a balance. We've got to prioritise, and we've got to structure our days so that we can achieve what we need to achieve, but also not at the expense of fundamental biology like sleep.
You mentioned it was in the 1950s that we discovered ways to make light and our use of light much more cheap and more accessible. It kind of reminds me a little bit about what happened in the 1970s and 80s with food. We found ways to make energy-dense, calorie-rich, super tasty foods that we can't resist. And now I think many of us are aware of this junk food problem that exists in society. you could kind of make the same case with lights that
It's a good analogy.
we have a junk light problem.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. I mean, it's very interesting because there was a House of Lords Science and Technology Select Committee on the impact of light and noise pollution on human health, and particularly how it affects our sleep-wake cycle. And it was really interesting to see how Parliament is now beginning to take these sorts of issues seriously. And I urge people to go onto the website, House of Lords website, and look at the Select Committee report. It's really interesting.
Let's just go back to partners for a minute sleeping in separate beds. When you have spoken about this at live talks or in the media before, what kind of comments have you had from people? Has there been a lot of pushback? Are some people saying, no, my husband and I have been doing this for 30 years and it's the best thing we ever did? Or are you mostly getting pushback against that idea?
I'm not getting pushback. In fact, what's happened is that a bunch of celebrities, then came out saying, "Oh yeah, well of course we sleep in separate beds," and actually, of course, endorsement by a celebrity means it's kind of okay to many people.
Forget endorsement by you.
Yeah,
who's been saying this.
Yeah, and so I know it's been the reverse. I think actually people have felt, phew, I'm so relieved. I don't have to feel guilty about it any longer.
And I think initially people probably push back because they think, yeah, what about intimacy? But I don't think sleeping in the same bedroom equals intimacy.
No.
Because you could, let's say, it's not an extreme example at all. I think it's happening in many bedrooms around the world where you're in a double bed with your partner, and each of you are on your own devices, right? You're physically in the same space, but mentally you could be tens of thousands of miles away. One of you is in your curated world of entertainment, and the other one is in their curated world. So yeah, sure, you're in the same bed, but is that intimacy? Well, no.
No, absolutely. And of course, if you want to promote intimacy, you have to have empathy. You have to be responsive to the behaviour of your partner. You have to have a sense of humour often. You have to enjoy other people, and you'll enjoy other people a lot more if you've had a good night of sleep.
So one option is separate rooms. Yeah. The other option, which you have touched on, which you first came across in Germany, is you're still in the same beds, but you have a separate duvet.
Yeah.
Are there any other options you can think of when it comes to couples potentially sort of dealing with this issue?
Yeah, of course, the default is earplugs, but a lot of people just can't cope with those to block out any snoring noise, for example. But temperature, I think, is also an important factor. Males and females have different temperature preferences on average. So men prefer a slightly lower temperature compared to females, compared to women. And what's the basis for that? Well, we don't fully know, but one argument is that men tend to be larger, therefore they have a reduced surface area to volume, so they're not going to lose heat as readily. Also, men tend to have more muscle than fat compared to women, and muscle is metabolically more active and they're therefore producing more heat. So that might be part of the difference, and why the Germans have used separate duvets. But there are now mattresses which also take the heat away from the sleeper, and I think it started as a bit of a sort of a selling issue, but there are data suggesting that actually they do improve sleep. I mean, we should talk about temperature and the importance of temperature for sleep generally.
Yeah, let's see that. It's interesting as you say that. I spoke to a friend of mine yesterday, and I told them that